Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving back into our journey through history and culture this time. We're headed somewhere truly unique. The DMZ, or Demilitarized Zone, between North and South Korea. If you've ever watched Korean dramas or films, chances are you've heard of the DMZ. It's often portrayed as this tense, mysterious borderland, sometimes even symbolic of the entire Korean conflict. Even in shows set far from Korea, like Kingdom or global hits that mention military tensions, the DMZ often sneaks its way into the story. And for those of you who've been lucky enough to travel to South Korea, you might know that visiting the DMZ is actually a real-life experience. It's not just history, it's part of the modern-day tour circuit. And here's the crazy part. It's only about 50 kilometers, or just over 30 miles from Seoul. That's like driving from downtown Los Angeles to Pasadena. It's that close, and yet it feels like another world. So stick with me because we're about to explore one of the most heavily guarded places on Earth and uncover the powerful story behind it. Now, before we get into the heart of the DMZ, we've got to rewind a bit because to really understand this place, you need to know its history. Back in 1945, when World War II came to an end, the Korean Peninsula didn't get to celebrate peace like the rest of the world. Instead, it was divided literally at the 38th parallel. The Soviet Union took control of the North, and the United States stepped in to oversee the South. But what started as a temporary solution quickly spiraled into something much darker. Tensions exploded, and in 1950, the Korean War began. It raged on for 3 brutal years, leaving around 1.05 million soldiers and civilians dead. That's right, over 1 million lives lost in a war that technically never ended. In 1953, the fighting stopped. But peace? Not exactly. That year, both sides agreed to an armistice, a ceasefire, not a peace treaty. And that's when the DMZ was born, the Demilitarized Zone. A narrow strip of land, about 2.5 miles wide, stretching across the peninsula, separating North Korea officially, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, from South Korea. So yeah, it's called a demilitarized zone, but in reality, it's one of the most heavily fortified borders on the planet. A constant reminder that the war technically never ended, and the peace is still on hold. So here's the thing technically, North and South Korea are still at war. DMZ stands for Demilitarized Zone, and it's a term used around the world. Any place where opposing forces agree to lay down their weapons and keep troops out, it's called a DMZ. All right, now let's get into the heart of the story, the Korean DMZ. Just about 30 miles north of Seoul, less than an hour's drive, you'll find one of the most heavily fortified borders in the world. After the armistice was signed in 1953, both North and South Korea agreed to each step back 2 kilometers from the 38th parallel. The result? A 4-kilometer wide stretch of no man's land, running 160 miles across the entire Korean peninsula. That's the DMZ, the Demilitarized Zone. It's technically a buffer, but in reality, it's a wall, a symbol of a war that never truly ended. And while it's called demilitarized, it's surrounded by soldiers, fences, mines, and surveillance. This place is massive, the largest demilitarized zone on Earth. And it's not just its size that makes it intimidating. When President Bill Clinton visited in 1993, he famously called it the scariest place on Earth. One glance across that border and you'll understand why. Let's be real. Most people don't visit the DMZ to go bird watching. They come because they're curious, intrigued by the mystery, the tension, the sheer weirdness of this place where 2 nations stare each other down across a line that was never meant to be permanent. And among all the sites inside the DMZ, there's one spot that stands out above the rest. A place loaded with history, symbolism, and risk. It's called Panmunjom, also known as the Joint Security Area, and it's easily the most sensitive patch of land in the entire DMZ. This is where it all happened. During the Korean War, Panmunjom played a key role as the setting for ceasefire talks. Just a tiny cluster of buildings in the middle of nowhere, yet it became the stage for some of the most intense negotiations of the 20th century. That's why it's sometimes nicknamed the War Village. But here's a cool little detail. The original name of the village wasn't Panmunjom. It was Dunbari, which translates roughly to Gate Valley. The name came from the way the doors of houses and the bridges were made from thick, rustic wooden planks. Later, when the area became a meeting point during the war, Chinese troops began referring to it as Banmon Diem, their pronunciation of the Korean name. And that version stuck. From then on, the world came to know this tiny village not as Dunbari, but as Panmunjom, a name born out of war, but now etched into the history books. Now here's something that trips up a lot of people, even seasoned travelers and news anchors. The pronunciation of names and places in East Asia, especially between Korean and Chinese romanizations, is a bit of a linguistic maze. Take the Korean Peninsula, for example. Most people know the capital of North Korea as Pyongyang. That's the romanized version of the Korean pronunciation. Meanwhile, South Korea's capital is Seoul. Simple enough, right? But it gets more confusing when we talk about names, especially the names of North Korea's leaders. In English, we often hear Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il, and Kim Jong-un. But here's the thing, those pronunciations are kind of a hybrid, influenced by both Korean and Chinese romanization systems. If we stuck strictly to the Korean pronunciation, Kim Jong-il would sound more like Kim Jong-il, and Kim Jong-un would be closer to Kim Jong-un. It might sound like a small difference, but to native speakers, it matters. It's part of identity, part of culture, and part of the reason why language and how we use it can shape the way we see the world. Let's head back to Panmunjom, the joint security area, arguably the most surreal tourist spot on Earth. And I mean that literally. People use the word surreal all the time to describe their visit here, because it doesn't feel real. It feels like stepping into a Cold War movie that never ended. Even if you're visiting from South Korea, you have to follow some very strict rules, starting with what you wear. No tight jeans, no t-shirts, no hoodies, definitely no slogans or anything even remotely provocative. Hip-hop style? Nope. Short skirts? Also a no-go. Why? Because everything you wear, every move you make, could be observed and used in propaganda by the other side. At this border, appearances matter. A lot. And just meters apart, South Korean and North Korean soldiers stand face to face. No heavy weapons, just sheer tension. The South Korean guards? They stand in a special stance, legs apart, fists clenched, half hidden behind buildings. Why? So they can react instantly if something goes wrong. Their position also helps them duck for cover at a moment's notice. And then there are the goggles. Every South Korean soldier here wears mirrored sunglasses, not just for the look, but for strategy. The mirrored lenses let them scan the north without revealing exactly where they're looking. It's all about control, precision, presence. This is Panmunjom, the front line of a war that never really ended. No shots fired, but the intensity, you can feel it in the air. Now, the real mind game begins when you talk about the psychological warfare between North and South Korea. This isn't just about tanks or guns, this is a battle of minds, and it's been playing out for decades. It all started back in 1953 when both Koreas agreed to build 2 small civilian villages in the heart of the DMZ. Sounds peaceful, right? A symbol of hope. To the south, it was known as a freedom village. To the north, it's a peace village. But in reality, these villages became epicenters of the war for hearts and minds. Let's break it down. These villages are essentially showcases, each side using these places to advertise their way of life. Up north, the so-called Peace Village is home to around 200 families. North Korea describes it as a thriving collective farm, complete with schools and hospitals. You might even spot farmers out in the fields or gardeners working in the village center. South Koreans are extremely curious about this place. The photos they've taken show towering buildings painted in bright colors, blue and white roofs, no less. But here's the kicker. The windows are either blurry or completely unclear. South Korea's take? Everything in that village is fake. The buildings? Just concrete shells with no real interiors. Even the electricity shuts off automatically. And those people walking around, they're not farmers, they're just actors, sweeping the streets to create an illusion of life. But that's not even the wildest part. On the South Korean side, there's this massive loudspeaker, a huge booming speaker, blasting propaganda songs about the North. These tunes praise life in the North, calling out to soldiers and discontented farmers, urging them to defect and reunite with their families. And then there's the flagpoles. North Korea had a 100-meter flagpole, but South Korea one-upped them, building a flagpole 98 meters tall in response. And as tensions escalated, South Korea didn't stop there, they went bigger. They built a flagpole that now stands at 160 meters, making it the 4th tallest flagpole in the world. That flag is hard to miss. Now, the real kicker here? North Korea's response. While the South sends these messages with loudspeakers, they've got a different strategy. They're blasting K-pop music into North Korea, seriously, at full volume. You can hear it up to 10 kilometers from the border, and at night, it carries even further 24 kilometers. North Korea hates K-pop, by the way. They've threatened South Korea over it because this music, this pop culture, is forbidden in the North. Even things like calling your boyfriend Oppa, a term popularized by K-pop, is banned in North Korea. It's crazy to think about two countries using the same language, but with only about 70% mutual understanding because of decades of separation. It's like they're playing a whole different game. A game of words, of sound, of messages, and even music. And believe it or not, it's only getting more intense. And if you thought things couldn't get weirder, let me tell you about one of the most bizarre psychological tactics used by South Korea back in 2014. In an effort to get inside North Korea's mind, South Korea dropped something unexpected. Chocopi. Yes, you heard that right, chocopi. A sweet little treat that became a symbol of something much bigger. Here's what happened. South Korea launched 50 giant balloons into the air, each carrying about 335 kilograms of chocopi, roughly 100,000 pieces. These balloons were released from the south and drifted over to North Korea. But this wasn't just a random candy drop, it had a purpose. Chocopi had already become a kind of currency in North Korea. Workers in North Korean factories would receive these treats as a bonus, and soon enough, it sparked a huge black market. The cost? Well, in South Korea, a single chocopi goes for about $0.25. But in North Korea, in the black market, it could cost up to $5. That's a big markup. And you know what North Korea did next? They started making their own chocopi. So now the treat is a bit of a cultural battleground, one sweet, soft cookie at a time. It's kind of wild to think that something as simple as a snack could spark such a complex story about power, control, and defiance. So, those are just some of the most fascinating things I've learned about the DMZ on the Korean Peninsula. I hope you enjoyed this little dive into history, and trust me, there's a lot more where that came from right here on the channel. I've got plenty of other stories I can't wait to share, and I'd love for you to stick around. If you found this interesting, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you won't miss any of my new videos. Thanks so much for tuning in. I'll catch you all in the next one.